We make sure that the aircraft is in a suitably clear area with the chocks in place. The fuel selector is now placed forward into the on position, and that opens the sluice gate at the bottom of the fuel tank. We can now flood the carburetor by depressing the flooder button here, and fuel then flows into the manifold, which then is seen to drain from the vent below the front chin cowl. The number of blades through which the engine must be sucked in tends to be idiosyncratic to your particular engine and whether it is hot or cold, but generally 4 to 6 blades should be sufficient. The starting drill is run by the swinger. It says the fuel is on, throttle is closed, both are off, and that is acknowledged by the pilot. The swinger then sucks the mixture in the same behaviour and same method as he would if the engine was live. That way, if there is a fault in the ignition, he won't be hurt. When ready to start, the swinger places the front switches up and asks the pilot to set the throttle a ½ inch open and the front magneto on. The pilot does this and calls contact. As soon as the engine starts, the second switch is put up and on, and the oil pressure checked that's rising. Oil pressure should be there within 30 seconds. Once that's done, the two individual magnetos can be checked for correct functioning and the engine warmed up. The time this takes will depend on the temperature outside and whether the engine is already warm or not. The engine is warmed at between 900 and 1000 RPM. The oil pressure should be at least 35 psi at 1000 RPM, and it will require 4 minutes to warm the engine at normal temperatures, but if it's cold it might be a lot longer, with 8 minutes plus. Once the engine is warmed up, check that the area behind the aircraft is clear, and then run the aircraft up to 1600 RPM to check the magnetos. They're checked individually. Each should have a maximum drop of 100 and a difference of 50 between the magnetos. The oil pressure should be 40 to 45 psi, and then throttle back to idle to check the idle speed. After removing the chocks, we're ready to taxi. Now, what we haven't discussed up to now is what to do if the engine fails to start. Having initially primed the aircraft and sucked in, and just to make it sure we know what we mean by sucking in, it's the process of turning the propeller over in the direction it's meant to run, which is supposed to suck the mixture into the cylinders. If the engine fails to start, then there's usually one of two reasons for it. One is that the mixture is incorrect. Well, if we've primed it correctly, then it should go. Or maybe the mixture is too rich, in which case we need to blow out, or we've got no ignition. So, to blow out, we must make sure that the switches are off, the throttle is opened fully, and at that point the person swinging rotates the blades the wrong way round by about 8 to 10 blades. The throttle is then set back for the starting position, and then the switches can be made live and the engine should start. If it's an ignition problem, we need to lift the right engine cowl up and have a look at the magneto. This is the impulse magneto. On a Tiger Moth it's on the starboard side. If the engine is the right way up, it's the other way round. So when you turn the propeller over, it winds up a spring in this unit here. That's the impulse starter. It consists of two weighted blocks that fly out and disengage once the engine is running. But when the engine is pulled over by hand at very slow speed, you should hear a positive click, which is this impulse unit firing. If it doesn't click, it may well be because it's jammed. They do need lubrication from time to time with light machine oil or even a little bit of graphite powder. So if they've jammed, you can hit it with a wood only, not the metal bit of a hammer, and just knock it in there, and you will find that there will be a click and you'll hear the pulls drop out again. Do not hit it with the steel part of the hammer, only with the wood. Follow it up. So to hear that, Graham is going to turn the propeller over. And again, please, Graham. Thank you. So hopefully that should get your engine running okay. The next problem that we're going to have a look at is one you may unfortunately come across. It's not ideal, but you may have to start the engine on your own. So what can we do to make it as safe as possible?
Starting the aircraft on your own is a potentially very hazardous procedure. It's always much better to get somebody else who's sitting around to come and guard the throttle. Quite a few Tiger Moths have gone flying on their own with nobody in them due to cock-ups during the starting. However, the reality is that you may well end up stuck somewhere or other without anyone else to do that job. So, what you must do is to put some decent chocks under the aircraft. If you haven't brought chocks with you, look for a decent large stone, slab or anything else that you can find that will provide some form of sensible chocking ability. Similarly, the rear controls need to be strapped in the fully elevator up position, just like this.
You can see here how I've used the aircraft harness to strap the stick fully back to try and prevent the aircraft nosing over.
So, once the aircraft's prepared, the next thing is it's all too easy to get out of sequence. I find that this is particularly tends to happen when you're hot and the aircraft refuses to start. So what I do starting the aircraft on myself is to get the aircraft prepared, ready to start, but don't get finely dressed with your coat or over trousers until the engine is actually running. Otherwise it's oh too easy to overheat, lose the sense of what you're doing, especially during the blowing out procedure if the aircraft is too rich, and end up trying to start the aircraft with full throttle set. Not a good idea. So once you've got the aircraft prepared, unlike our normal bit of starting the propeller from being in front of it, you can actually start the aircraft from behind the propeller. Some people have never heard of that, and others think, wow, that's a very dangerous thing to do. In fact, in many ways it's much safer. Where would you be standing if the aircraft was on floats? It'd be a bit wet in front of it. So, preparing the aircraft, make sure that the fuel is fully on and latched, that the throttle is closed, and the ignition switches are both off. The aircraft can then be primed and it's ready to suck in. One of the great things about starting the aircraft from behind the propeller is that if it does go forward, it's not going to go into you, so that's safe. Also, we can lean back to operate the throttle from the front cockpit. The South African aircraft don't have magneto switches at the front, but most of the UK ones do, so it's very easy if it all goes wrong to put the switches off. So with the aircraft fully primed and ready to go, it's time to suck in. The technique, if I angle the camera out slightly, is to come up to the prop and then, as before, if you were starting it from the front of it, just pull the prop back and chuck it through. You don't need an enormously quick swing, because remember it's the impulse that's actually going to fire the charge. So again, put it down and set, left hand there, stand back and forward.
Once sucked in, set the propeller at the start position.
Once sucked in, set the throttle just 1/4 of an inch open, and do ensure that the friction nut is nice and tight. The ignition switches can be then set to on, and remember the aircraft is now in a dangerous state, so take care.
Once the engine is running, check that the oil pressure has risen and set it to about 800 RPM while you now get dressed and prepare for taxiing. Quite rightly, Francis Donaldson asked me to put a little warning on this section to remind you not to get out of synchronization with the mag switches when you're starting the engine, and be particularly vigilant when the aircraft is difficult to start or during the blowing out drill. Every time the blade has been swung, the switches should be placed to off while the propeller is reset, ready for the next swing. Particularly, as Steve Barrett, the Cambridge Flying Group CFI, points out, if like him, you're a short arse. So put the switches off, reset the blade ready to swing, and then put the switches back on again, swing it, and if it fails to fire, switches off for another prop reset. However, I would cancel that you get to know where your magneto impulse unit, that click, is ready to fire. The problem is that if the aeroplane is very difficult to start, it's still not impossible to get out of sequence with putting the switches on and off while you set the propeller, leading to the propeller being live when you don't think it is and off when you expect it to fire. It's been done before, so slow things up and take particular care. While I was making this film in South Africa, I was actually turning the engine over with the switches off. But you can see how it can be difficult to start the propeller round into its correct firing position, particularly as Steve said if you're short. So if you do have to set the propeller blade, put the switches off, set the blade, switches on and swing. If it fails to start, switches off, reset the blade, switches on and swing. If she's difficult to start, remember to slow down and keep calm.